Welcome, friends, to another We're Not Done Yet conversation. I'm Elizabeth Macdonald, and with me is Jackie Harper, retired United Church minister who loves to quilt and is deeply committed to affirming ministries. Jackie, when did you first become aware of the affirming movement, and how did it become a priority in your life?
Oh, I probably became aware of the actual Affirming United movement in the late 90s, probably. But the whole concept of creating inclusive community for gender diversity and sexual orientations had been very much a part of my awareness long before that.
Well, now you've taken on a particular role with Affirm United, Ça fait ensemble. Can you describe what you're doing these days with and for Affirm United?
Yes, I'm what we call a regional coordinator for Affirming Ministries, and there's 3 of us across Canada. I am responsible for Eastern Canada, so Quebec, the Maritime Provinces, Newfoundland and Labrador, and I'm there to support congregations as they, communities of faith, as they decide to engage in the affirming ministry process. Linda Hutchinson is another one of the coordinators, and she's responsible for Ontario. Plus, she coordinates all of the connection with the Affirm Council, and she coordinates all the celebration of ministries.
And she has been a wonderful, wonderful friend to many of us in this part of the church, in our East Central Ontario Regional Council.
Yeah, we're very blessed to have her as a part of our regional council. And then Liz Carter Morgan does the western part from Manitoba West. And so the 3 of us work together, though individually, working with communities of faith, primarily, though we have worked with camps, educational centers, regional councils, as we are with the Central Ontario Regional Council. Did I say education centers already?
We'll add them to the list.
And assisted living buildings and things. So there's a broad spectrum of ministries that we try to support, but primarily it's with local communities of faith. And so they usually express some interest, and they connect on the Affirm United Affirming Ensemble's website, and they then they're directed to one of the 3 of us, and we make initial contact. And
so I do want to explore with you a little bit more of what's involved in that. I'm struck, given this pandemic, that, and you covering the Maritimes, Quebec, that you're probably becoming quite expert at Zoom meetings and connecting with people in a virtual way as you walk with them on their affirming journey.
Yeah, I mean, like everybody else, COVID has changed the way we do things. I would say the first 6 months last year that we were kind of immersed in the COVID experience, everything basically shut down. If we got 1 or 2 emails a month, that was it. It was just really quiet. But then I think communities of faith figured out that there were things they could do, or regional councils figured out there were things they could do by Zoom or by telephone. And we began to pick up again. And so we've had communities of faith who have done all of their education process on Zoom.
Oh my gosh.
I know, like
Like
I
that.
just find it incredible. Like I think, you know, one, that people make the commitment to do it over and above Sunday morning worship, I think is amazing. But just that, you know, part of being face to face and is that you get to read body language, and you don't always get that opportunity on Zoom. You see their face, but you might not see the rest of their body. And as a facilitator of a discussion, it's often what's not said that helps you to address some of the issues that might be emerging. And
we're having to learn new ways to communicate, just as I'm sure the communities of faith you're working with are having to learn new ways of communicating. One of the reactions that we sometimes hear are individuals and communities saying, we're already welcoming. Why do we have to become affirming? What do you say to that kind of reaction?
well, I often share from my own personal experience, and you know, I'll say, you know, when I began working at the general counsel office, one of the things was I needed to find a new faith home. And I was looking around, and I lived in an urban area, so it was easy. There were lots of choices. And I went to one church 6 weeks in a row, and no one spoke to me in those 6 weeks. And the tagline on the church billboard, you know, said, "The friendly church on the corner." And I thought, oh my goodness, you know, like I wanted to go to church. I kept coming back, hoping that there would be some, you know, so we think we're welcoming and often, but we might only talk to the people that we know. And so then you don't make those connections in the same way. So I think that was one experience of mine that I sometimes share when people say that they're welcoming, is that that's, you know, you may use the language, but you may not live it out. You know, maybe to each other you're welcoming, but what about the visitor? What about the person who's searching? I remember a young woman when I was working with the conference who said, who identified as non-binary, and wanted to know if the church would be a safe place for her, and what would she look for if she was trying to make that decision. And she said one of the first things she looks for is the sign of the rainbow. And you know, so if there's evidence of the rainbow somewhere on a church sign or something, that makes her feel a little bit more confident. But one of the things she learned is that we use rainbows without always knowing the connection it has with Affirm United, because it is part of the biblical story of Noah and God's promise. And so
it's also that wonderful rainbow that M&S has used as part of its logo. Yes, you're right.
So it's not always a guarantee that a church will be particularly sensitive to people's issues around gender diversity or sexual orientations. And
so that's what makes it so important that a community of faith be public, intentional, and
explicit. Yes, the pie.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now another reaction that it has surfaced in parts of Eastern Ontario. I'm wondering if you have encountered this reaction and what you might say if you have encountered this reaction. It's a little more resistant. The reaction that goes something like, we don't have any of those people here.
Yeah, and I've heard that many times, as many people have, and I would often be I would just make some kind of comment like, do you really know who all the people of your faith community or community of faith are related to and who their friends are. How do you know that so and so doesn't have a son or a daughter, a child? I shouldn't even use son or daughter anymore. A child who identifies in the spectrum, or how do you not know what somebody's colleague is? And so when we say those people, it's it's very limiting in how we can be community to each other. And I have this great story that my mom would attend church with me, and when after I retired from the conference office, I took a full year off and didn't do anything. But then churches started phoning and saying, "Could you help?" And so one Sunday, I would started doing a bit of pulpit supply, and then at Cressy Glenora pastoral charge asked me if I would do a 3-month interim with them, which turned out to be almost a 2-year interim.
Oh my gosh.
But one of the conditions I put on going there was that I would need an inclusive marriage policy, which is part of the affirming process, is to have an inclusive marriage policy. The church had an implicit statement, but they didn't have an explicit statement. And so, so they voted on it, and, they made the statement more explicit, and I could agree with it. Well, one of the people from the congregation was telling this woman from the area that I wouldn't have come if they hadn't met if they hadn't included an explicit marriage policy. And the woman's response was, "Well, I understand that completely. She always has that woman with her." And stuff. So
this woman being your mother?
The woman was my mother, yes, and stuff. And so it was just that assumption that it was those people were in their church and stuff. And I'm thinking, we make really bad assumptions that can be really hurtful for people, or can be very life affirming. But I think we need to give people the opportunity to self-identify in a safe, inclusive, welcoming space. And so one of my policies has always been in ministry is that I ask people to self-identify and tell me how you want to be named. And so that's one of the reasons we will see more and more people putting their pronouns on their screens, or at the bottom of signing their signature or whatever. They're self-identifying. They're telling people, this is who I am, and this is how I wish to be addressed. And so we're learning to use the pronouns that people want to be addressed by it. I always say, I think God has an incredible sense of humor, because in the late 70s, at theological school, I was really pushing for inclusive language and asking my colleagues to, use inclusive language, and met with all kinds of resistance. I mean, we still meet with some resistance even 40 years later, but I would, and I remember thinking, but if you care about me and you need to pay attention to what I'm asking for. And I think, oh, God has such a humor, because here I am 40 years later learning a new language and learning to use proper pronouns and things.
So Jackie, you're talking about what you've learned, and I'm struck by the fact that often becoming affirming is described not so much as a destination. It's not a final decision, but rather it is a step in a journey. And that being part of an affirming community, an affirming ministry, really does involve the need to be open to learn. You've described a couple of ways, couple of very significant learnings you've had. I wonder if there's any other, is there anything more you want to say about what this has meant for you, this work you've done in the affirming movement? What has it meant for your own learning journey?
Well, I guess I want to step back one and say that one of the congregations I had the pleasure of working with over this past 18 months in Nova Scotia they made the decision they were going to engage in the affirming process, and then develop their education process around all the different affirming places they wanted to engage. So they looked at language, they looked at accessibility, they looked at economic realities, so they did this broad spectrum of looking at what it would mean to be an inclusive, welcoming, public, intentional, explicit faith community. And then they looked at gender identities and sexual orientations. And I thought, that's the intent of the affirming process. We need to look at gender identities and sexual orientations because people have faced such discrimination in the church, and there are still denominations that are very unkind and unwelcoming. And even as much as I'm ashamed to admit, even in the United Church, we don't always offer an inclusive, affirming welcome. But this congregation took it seriously. They looked at the broad spectrum of what it means. And I guess that's what I want to say is what I've learned is, even when I think I should know everything and I should be at the place where I've got all the answers and I'm always learning something new. Like a few years back, I was learning about transgender issues, and then it was around the non-binary issues, and I'm constantly being stretched, and I think that's why I love the works, because it continues to help me live into a fundamental belief that I have, that all people are created in the image of God, and that my understanding of God's intention is always limited. And God's understanding is so much greater than anything I can comprehend. And I shared this story joke with the congregation, this Cressy Glenora pastoral charge, and I love it. It's one that resonates in my head, and it's St. Peter and Gabriel standing at the gates saying, heaven's getting awfully crowded. There's more people here than, I think we've let in. And Gabriel says, I'm going to go out and investigate it. And then he comes back a while later and he says, oh, that Jesus guy is just pulling them over the wall. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's what it is. Like, it's if we shut the gates, then there's got to be somebody who can pull over the wall.
We are smiling, we're laughing, but this is no laughing matter. What you're talking about is very serious and very real. Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's why I love the post-Easter stories, because they're all about the church learning to make their community more open and accessible to a variety of people. You don't have to become Jewish. You can be an Enoch eunuch. Sorry, you can, there's just nothing's unclean that God has made. Like they're all those post-Easter stories.
Well, thank you for reminding us and for sharing your own learning, because I do think that many of us, especially when we get into the "we're not done yet" group, a very wonderful group, but there is the tendency to think by the time we reach this stage, we should know it. We should have learned. But what I'm hearing you say loud and clear, and pointing to to the way scripture says this to us, the gospel says this to us, that no, the learning is never over, especially when it comes to creating community and being about radical hospitality and opening the doors, not shutting the gates.
Yeah.
We've been talking mostly about communities of faith, and I'm wondering about your thoughts. Love to hear you speak a bit about why is it important that other ministries go through the process and make that decision, that choice to become an affirming ministry. We've seen the UCW in certainly in this part of Ontario. They've made that choice. The Central Ontario Regional Council, already an interim affirming ministry in the process of becoming fully affirming. Why is it so important that other ministries beyond the local community of faith take this on, make this choice?
I think for me, it has to do with, it's about life. It's about affirming diversity, and it's about honoring differences, and that happens at every court of the church. And so to honor and make a safe place for people can happen. It needs to happen in all the places we are church together. And for me, when I was part of Bay of Quinte, the former Bay of Quinte, I strongly encouraged the affirming group to look at Bay of Quinte becoming affirming, and we engaged in that process, of which you and Bruce
we worked together on that, Jackie,
offered
and
much of the
others.
leadership.
Yes,
And
yes,
you know, so it's a deeply held commitment I have. And I think of the young people that I've had the privilege of working with through the years, and how so many of them would not have been in the church if we had not engaged in the process, because their world is very different than the world I grew up in. And many of us in the church, this is in local communities of faith, this is pushing our boundaries. But I don't think there's anything wrong with being pushed, our boundaries being pushed, and learning something new. And so for me, it's that ongoing growth in faith, that this is one more step we're being asked to take. Just like back in the 80s, we were being asked to use inclusive language, and then the membership ministry and human sexuality report. You know, we're looking at what it means to be an anti-racist church. There's always places for us to grow, and this is just one more place for us to continue that journey. And so, and if we say we're the United Church, then I want us to live up to the best of what it means to be United Church. And that means being that radical, welcoming institution. And that takes place at regional council level, at camps, at seniors residence, and
just about everywhere.
Yeah, it belongs everywhere, I guess. Yeah. And
Jackie, thank you so much. Your observations, your insight, your wisdom, all worth us paying attention to very closely. Thank you so much.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Take care.
Bye for now.
Bye.